Um, Welcome back, everyone. After the break, so without further ado, we're going to talk about the parking mini zones. I know a lot of viewers or listeners have had letters. I know I've been sent letters, and a lot of people puzzled. But Andrew, do you want to talk about the parking mini zones and what's happening with it?
Yeah, so this has been a very confusing subject from day one, and this started last summer when people were kind of just noticed on the council website this change to the mini parking zones. It was then due to come in place in September, but many of you wrote emails to the council. Many of you, I think over 6,000 people, signed a petition asking for this not to happen. And then Pirumir and I also raised another petition on the council website, which more than 2,000 of you signed. So last September, the Mayor, John Biggs, and the council meetings have agreed to put this on hold. And everybody thought, it's done, it's not going to happen. But at the following cabinet meeting, he actually sort of decided to go ahead with this mini zone change, but didn't announce a date. So from the 2nd of March, it goes live. And just as a reminder of what that means. So today, Tower Hamlets is broken into sort of 4 main parking zones, so A, B, C, and D. And then each area is broken down into mini zones. For example, the Isle of Dogs is broken down into mini zones D1 and D2. But today, you can, if you're a D1 or D2 permit holder, you can park anywhere in zone D for the whole day. And what will change on the 2nd of March is you'll only be allowed to park in your own mini zone, D1 or D2, for the whole day. And you can only park in any other mini zone, including D1 or D2, for 3 hours maximum. So it basically reduces the space in which you're allowed to park for the whole day. And we know for some people this will cause sort of some major issues. Hopefully you will have had a map sent to you by the council last week explaining where these zones are. But basically, if you just look on your street at the council parking signs, they'll have a little tag in the corner that will say A1 or B2 or something along those lines. And that will tell you, and you have to look at your own permit, which is obviously now online, to see where you're actually allowed to park. I hope in the first month they'll only send out warning letters. But after that, if you park in the wrong zone for more than 3 hours, then you could get a fine of £65, unfortunately. We did try and do something about this last year, and many of you signed those petitions, but unfortunately that change is definitely going ahead. We had originally asked that it be delayed until after COVID, because we know lots of you are suffering from parking issues. But the interesting thing is that the council are changing the rules.
I think someone's ringing us. Wow. Let me just get that.
Okay, so Puru will try and answer that one, and I'll keep talking. I told you a little while ago we're novices at this. This is the first time we've done this. But what the council, I think, have done kind of to soften the impact of this is they're kind of merging zones. So, for example, zones C2 and C4 are due to be merged, I think, and C3 and C4. So, for example, like if you're in Shadwell, there's enormous parking pressure in Shadwell, slightly less so in Wapping. And what the council are doing is allowing people who live in Shadwell to go park in Wapping, which will reduce some of the pressure. And I think they'll probably end up doing that in quite a few areas, which kind of raises a point, why bother doing this if all you're going to end up doing is changing the mini zone boundaries to reduce the impact of doing this in the first place?
I think it brings a bigger question as to the impact of COVID and post-COVID as well. We are going to be hit economically, London and Tower Hamlets in general, and patterns have changed. And the way we use a space or streets will have to change as well. And it seems a bit arbitrary. It goes against sort of like logic in the sense that if you're witnessing changes in the area and we don't know what the eventual outcome is it the right moment to bring in those changes? Shouldn't we bring in changes that in light of more data? And it seems that there's a lot of ignorance, or let's say a lot of myths that are banding around. For example, in Tower Hamlets, it's only the wealthy that own cars, and normal folks don't own cars. But that is not the reality. You walk down any street, they're not full of Porsches or Mercedes or BMWs. There's a lot of them are family cars, a lot of them are hatchbacks, etc. A lot of you talk to people. If you walk around, talk to people on their housing estates. A lot of people's jobs are linked to their cars, either in the building trade, or as delivery drivers, or as cabbies. And what's happened is, because of COVID and the impact on employment, more and more people are working for Deliveroo's or Uber Eats. You're getting more and more people going into that. So we need to sort of like look at the impact, and it seems kind of crazy without looking at the impact that we're pushing in those changes. What about your experience, Andrew? Have you had conversations with residents?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, especially because I'm on the Isle of Dogs, actually we have less parking pressure, at least on the southern bit of the Isle of Dogs, than almost anywhere else in Tower Hamlets. So this is really an issue that really impacts kind of the northwest of the borough. It's a kind of Whitechapel and sort of Brick Lane kind of area. And it's very interesting that the council actually in those areas issue more parking permits than there are parking bays on the street. So it's almost deliberate that there's just not enough parking spaces. Whereas on the Isle of Dogs, there is much closer ratio that basically for every 100 car parking spaces, there's probably 95 car parking permits. So on the Isle of Dogs, for example, our main parking pressures are actually at night time and at weekends, because people who live in car-free developments then bring their cars, which is a different issue from the daytime problem that we find in the northwest. But what was very interesting was listening to people's individual stories about why they needed their cars and why they needed to park across boundaries. So, one parent, for example, ended up, their children went to school in, Roman Road area, and they lived on the Isle of Dogs, and there are no bus routes. And the DLR doesn't go in that direction, and even the underground doesn't really fit. So the only way they can get their children to school on time from the Isle of Dogs back to Roman Road is by driving. And in his particular case, he drives back. But then there's other parents who I know then work near to where the schools are. So they drop off their children in different schools, and then drive to a third leg. So in this case, I think he had 3 different locations he had to drop off. And then his third location was at another school where he himself worked. And I think this is my concern, is that the other interesting thing is when the council did a survey of how big a problem this was, the evidence that they had suggested this was not actually that big a problem. This mainly, I think, affects quite a small group of people, but when it impacts them, it really impacts the way they live their daily lives quite dramatically.
Yeah. I think the other thing is, I don't think we need to have a study of how cars are used. I know anecdotally, so like low income families need to do bulk shopping. They need to go to these wholesalers. That's the only way you have access to cheap, good quality food. Like a sack of onions. You can't try getting on a bus with a sack of onions or a sack of rice. You need the car, and so I don't think we need to have a proper study as to the use of cars. I don't think people realize what the use of cars are in the borough, and we have one of the lowest car ownership as well. And the other issue is that a lot of the traffic that's generated is through traffic. So we need to have a proper study and a proper conversation, rather than going on these assumptions that it's only rich folks that drive cars, or people from outside of Tower Hamlets, who landlords. That's the other one I heard. Oh, it's landlords. I didn't realize there were so many landlords driving around in Tower Hamlets. But we need to go into the facts rather than fiction and make a decision. But where do you think this is going, Andrew? Do you think it's going to come back to full council? Is there an appetite for you to bring it back?
We would need the community to help us to do that, because we need to do another petition. And reality is that I don't think it's going to have any impact, because the mayor has already made his mind up on this, and he doesn't like changing it. But I will contradict you on something you just said about the people who have cars. So the problem is the only information we have about car usage and who has cars is actually from the 2011 census. So in 2011, I know from that 46% of households living in social affordable housing had cars. I know that 53% of children lived in a family household with a car, and actually they were the highest age group with that percentage. I know from that that the groups least likely to have cars are basically people who live alone in rented accommodation, which kind of makes sense, and also who are in their 20s and 30s. And that kind of makes sense. And I suspect that in 2011, if you actually you worked out how many people lived in each household, that approximately just over 50%, no, actually, I think I calculated, I think around 46 to 50% of people in Tower Hamlets had access to a car in 2011. But that's old data, and I'm going to make a quick plug. So in March, there's the next national census. So in March, you're all going to be asked to fill in a census form. And historically, we've had problems in Tower Hamlets getting people to fill those in. And certainly I and others will be pushing quite hard. You really, really need to fill in that census form and make it as accurate as possible, because a lot of this data about who has cars and why they have cars and the kind of jobs that you do, the only place we get that information from is from the national census. And it's only done every 10 years. And the next one is in March. So you're going to be hearing lots of plugs encouraging you to fill in that census, because without that data, we're making decisions blind. And unfortunately, Tower Hamlets Council don't even bother looking at that 2011 data too often.
Yeah, it's really important, because a lot of spending decisions, etc., centrally and locally, are made, or locally supposed to be made, on the basis of the census data. I know in America, federal funding is linked to how many people sign on, and that's why in New York, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, actually made sure that they got accurate figures to get that funding in. So it's really important that everybody chips in, puts the correct data on there, because without that, we won't be able to make decisions such as housing, schools, etc., and make the arguments for more investment in the area. So it's time for a break. It's 7:30.